You're listening to the Mississippi Outdoors Podcast. I'm your host, Matt Wyatt. What do you think about these names? Lonesome Gravedigger, War Paint Mud Bug. We're not talking wrestling or monster trucks. No, we're talking about crustaceans, specifically crawfish or crayfish, whichever you prefer, with Calvin Rezac, aquatic biologist from the Mississippi Museum of Natural Science.
Mississippi Outdoors is sponsored by Entergy Mississippi. Entergy is building a stronger and cleaner grid to power a brighter future and protect our great outdoors for generations to come.
You're listening to the Mississippi Outdoors Podcast. I'm your host, Matt Wyatt. And today, crawfish, or is it crayfish? In fact, which is it? Let's learn which it is with Calvin Rezac, aquatic biologist at the Mississippi Museum of Natural Science here on the show. Hey, Calvin.
That's correct. How's it going?
Great. So you even brought us examples. We got some show and tell going on.
I brought a few.
But let's start right there. Crayfish, crawfish, yes, no, which is it?
Both. Depends where you're from. You know, it's a hotly debated topic if you're in my position. You know, I think we'll talk a little bit about my backstory, but I'm originally from Minnesota, so I say crayfish, but I also say crawfish. I kind of go back and forth. You know, people predominantly down here in the South say crawfish. My wife, she's from Arkansas. She says crawdad. People in Australia say yabby. So there's lots of different terminology for these things, but we're all talking about the same thing. You're not really wrong. If you're maybe saying it in more of a scientific study aspect, the correct term, I guess, would be crayfish, but I kind of prefer crawfish. So yeah.
Okay. So it's almost like pecan or pecan.
Exactly. Tomato. Yes. Yeah. Exactly.
Okay. Yeah. So you mentioned that you grew up in long way from here, right?
Yeah. Just follow the Mississippi River north, and yeah, you'll get to where I'm from. Yeah, from Minnesota.
Minnesota.
Mm-hmm.
So naturally, land of 1,000 lakes, plenty of water. You grew up in and around the water, I guess. Yeah,
I did. You know, I kind of. You know, my family really, they enjoyed fishing a lot and hunting. A lot of great mentors and uncles that really loved to hunt and fish. And so that was a part of my growing up. And, you know, we really loved to float in canoes and kayaks down rivers. So that was, you know, a lot of what I did as a child growing up in Minnesota.
Yeah. I have some guys that I watch on YouTube who are, I'm fascinated. They'll get in the streams and they're in the kayaks, fast moving water, cold water, catching giant smallmouth in Minnesota, which crawfish, crayfish, kind of a primary food source for fish in those lakes, river streams where you're from, right?
Yeah, exactly. You know, I think a commonly used piece of tackle or lure is a crayfish trying to catch smallmouth bass. I mean, I've done that a lot in Minnesota. I love smallmouth bass fishing. That's a lot of fun. They come in all kinds of different shades of colors, you know, that you throw at them, or plastic baits or hard baits. You know, if we're talking about crayfish in a natural setting, in the water, crayfish are usually brown, just as a form of camouflage. But you know, when it comes to fishing, kind of anything that might draw a fish's attention, maybe it's a brightly red colored crayfish might attract a fish to strike. So
yeah, you know, one of those other terms you said, crawdad. It's interesting. I grew up in Alabama, North Alabama, and that's the term I would hear. And when we would find them in creeks and streams, and we'd pick them up in our hand, you know, smaller, some of them almost translucent.
Yeah.
And my buddies would say crawdad, you know, but I've lived in Mississippi so long now, I don't even hear that term anymore. It's crawfish.
But it kind of came back to you. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I hear a lot of stories of people, you know, catching crawdads, or mud bugs is another term.
Yeah.
Out of ditches, and either with a net, or some people have told me of stories of catching crayfish in their burrows. If you didn't know, crayfish live underground in the terrestrial environment. So crayfish can live in a variety of different areas, lakes, streams, ponds, swamps, oxbows, but they also live in ditches. They live underground. They might live in your front yard.
Really?
And so some people, yeah. Do you ever see those little piles of mud? Maybe, I don't know.
Sure.
In your front yard, you might run them over with your lawnmower. That's a crayfish.
Really?
Yeah, and that's predominantly what I've been studying since I've been here in Mississippi. Are these, we call them burrowing crayfish, that they live underground, and they're really fascinating animals. Yeah.
Okay, so in terms of how they look, the burrowing crayfish. I mean, I see the little mud.
Yeah.
I'm like, what is that? Something they burrowed in the yard. They look the same as the ones we may see in the water?
Generally, a crayfish is a crayfish. They look generally similar.
Okay.
What would make a burrowing crayfish different is that generally they're smaller.
Okay.
But they have some crazy colors to them. They can be a bright red, olive green, brown, but electric blue, shades of yellow on them. They're really crazy, cool looking animals. Yeah.
As I hear you talk about them, I find myself thinking, okay, how'd you get into that? Specifically kind of focusing on crawfish, crayfish for you. How'd that happen?
For crayfish, I originally have a fish background.
Okay.
But, as I've kind of come through my studies and kind of gotten to Mississippi where I am now, I've just learned that I'm really fascinated in kind of anything that lives in the water, and predominantly freshwater in our rivers and streams. And so there was an opportunity for me to kind of take the challenge that crayfish is on, and so at the museum, and so I kind of just took it and ran with it. And so the last couple of years I've been studying crayfish.
Okay. So in Mississippi, in our state, how many different species of crayfish, crawfish?
Do you have any guess? Yeah.
No. I don't know what to guess on those kinds of things.
I'll guess.
Go ahead, Chip.
Let's say 6.
6? Higher than that, times 10.
Really?
So we've got in the state of Mississippi, we've got between 65 and 70 species of crayfish, crawfish. And so that's a rather high number for the whole U.S. or even we're talking about the world. So this is a hot spot for crayfish diversity. I mean, I think we're 4th. So Alabama's number 1. I think they got 100. They got a good football team too, and they got 100 crayfish. But we're 4th. I think we're behind Tennessee and I think Georgia.
Okay. See, I'm surprised Louisiana wasn't up there. I mean, so they're kind of known for
right. They're the crayfish state, but here we have considerable amount more species than they do.
Wow. How about that? Didn't notice that. And wouldn't have thought Alabama number 1.
Yeah.
Okay. So like Mississippi, Alabama, they have a coast where, the border saltwater, brackish water, come north, it's fresh water. Does that factor in to the different species, having more species?
Yeah. That's pretty accurate. So it's just that Mississippi has a lot of really diverse habitats.
Okay.
Different geological layers that might prevent species from moving across boundaries, and over time they develop different life strategies and different adaptations that help make them different species. They look different, they act different. The coastline definitely plays a part in it. Down in southern Mississippi is probably some of the highest diversity of crayfish that we have in the state. I think there's 13 species of crayfish that are only found in Mississippi, nowhere else in the world. And down south, we have a lot of them. And a lot of them like to key in on the sandy soils, the bog type habitat, the pitcher plants. Oftentimes you'll get some really unique endemic crayfish in those kinds of habitats that are found along the coast of Mississippi.
Really cool. All right. So in the spring, we have crawfish boil.
Yeah.
And so we're eating them. What kind is that? And is that the kind that, maybe is most common, the kind that we eat actually? Yeah.
So we've got 2 crayfish that we usually eat for human consumption, and that is the red swamp crayfish and the white river crayfish.
Okay.
And so that really kind of started that whole business, really started in Louisiana. It's predominantly where a lot of crayfish are grown. But those are the two crayfish we predominantly eat. Both of them are found in Mississippi. Both are naturally occurring in Mississippi. They are probably two of the most common crayfish you can find in Mississippi. But those crayfish, the red swamp crayfish, the white river crayfish, are usually found in slower moving water, found in lakes and kind of pond environments.
Okay.
So if someone's at a crawfish boil, is there a way for them to tell the difference between which species they're eating?
Yeah. So between the two crayfish, right, you got the red swamp crayfish. Generally, it can be a little bit larger of the two. But if there's a structure on a crayfish, on the carapace, which is just that shell that is part of the head, if you flip it you're looking at down on its back, there's a structure there called the areola, and it's the gap. You might notice there's two lines on that crayfish along its back, and if there's a gap there, that is a red swamp crayfish, and if that gap is closed, then that is a white river crayfish. And so you can figure out your species, what you're eating, by looking at the back of the crayfish. You can also tell if it's a male or female by flipping it over. And so the male, and this is predominantly how we tell crayfish species apart, is they have these the sexual reproductive organs of the crayfish on the other side of the tail. There's two structures there called gonopods, and you'll only find those on the males. You won't find those on the females. And in crayfish world, those gonopods come in just different kind of like shapes. And so it's kind of like a lock and key kind of thing. And so, I guess this is my way of just saying you can kind of play with your food and figure out, sort your crayfish into piles, male, female, white river crayfish, red swamp crayfish.
How about that?
Yeah.
Okay. And excuse me. So we have show and tell.
Yeah.
Here. And I'm wondering, the one that's in the tall box that you brought, I'm wondering if that's the red swamp. Am I off? Am I close? What?
So I've got three crayfish here. I've got the one in the tall box is what is called a war paint mud bug.
War paint mud bug.
Crayfish have some really cool names. Lonesome grave digger, banded mud bug.
Wow.
They got some wild names.
They have names that would be perfect for like monster truck rally.
Yeah.
Maybe like wrestling.
Yeah.
So give me those names again.
Lonesome grave digger, banded mud bug.
Okay.
Speckled burrowing crayfish. There's some really, really crazy names, but this one I brought him in as a kind of an example of a native crayfish. Okay. And so he is, or she is, a specimen we have on display at the museum. Okay. But you can find them pretty much throughout Mississippi. They're probably in your backyard. They're oftentimes along a creek or a stream. But this is a burrowing crayfish. It's also kind of rivals the size of a red swamp crayfish.
Okay.
So
from I get credit from my eye distance.
Yeah,
saying, okay, it's close to the size of what we're eating.
Very close. It's about, it can get to the size of your hand, but we have some crayfish that are about the size of a quarter. That's a full-size crayfish. And then the other two crayfish I brought in were, I do have a red swamp crayfish and a white river crayfish.
Okay.
And I brought one in, and it's kind of has a little bit of blue on it.
Okay.
It's not completely a blue crayfish, but
it has some of the blue on there.
Some of the blue, and I would suspect that if given a few more molts, that it would turn more and more blue with each molting period.
Okay, and when somebody listening hears that word, molt, molting period, what are we talking about?
So crayfish, as they grow larger, molt. They molt their exoskeleton. So, kind of like a caterpillar develops into a moth. They kind of go through that. They kind of go through a really crazy transformation. A crayfish really just sheds its outer shell and underneath that old shell is a soft material, soft shell. So they'll get rid of that old shell, and then once exposed to the air, they're kind of soft, but over time they'll harden, and then crayfish can molt a few times a year, and they molt quite frequently when they're smaller because they're growing a lot.
This would be an observation that, like I made all those years ago as a little kid picking one up in a stream is pinchers.
Mm-hmm.
They obviously have those. And are they, for crayfish, crawfish, are they pretty much the same in that they're all about the same size as far as pinchers, strength, use? I mean, is that the same throughout the species?
So they can vary pretty considerably. They can have different numbers of tubercles or bumps on the crayfish claw. They can different colors for sure.
Okay.
The burrowing crayfish tend to have larger pinchers. They're also called in my world like chile. They call them, or quila. Other people call them. But they can be quite larger because they need those large forearms to excavate the soil that they're digging and moving it to the surface. Mm-hmm. Whereas if you pick up a crayfish and it has slender, skinnier claws, generally that crayfish isn't a burrowing crayfish.
Okay.
It just lives in stream environments or ponds.
These, for instance, that you brought,
mm-hmm.
they're on display usually at the museum?
Yeah, we do have them in the amphibia tank. So they live side by side with an amphibian that they're often found in the natural environment. So you can see those at the Mississippi Museum of Natural Science. Yeah.
Okay. The smaller container there has the kind that we eat, the red swamp and the white river.
Mm-hmm.
Do they ever cross? Those two ever cross? Like we get hybrids?
Not really.
Not
so
really?
like I was saying with in crayfish, in the crayfish world, right, these males have these gonopod structures, and it's like a lock and key.
Okay.
So they really don't hybridize. A male isn't gonna fit with a female. They aren't gonna hybridize.
Okay. And so right now they're having a conversation, but there's no sparks.
No, there's no romantic interest here.
That's neat. I think too, 14, we'd say, 14 different species in the state of Mississippi. What purpose do they serve? Like overall, in terms of the ecosystem, like what do they give us?
Right. Well, in large crayfish in general, really this economic importance to us here in the state of Mississippi, both in the Southeast, because we grow them oftentimes along with in rice fields. They're also really culturally significant. There's nothing better, in my opinion, than in the springtime, hanging out with your buddies or on a crawfish boil with a beer in hand, and that's just one of the best times of year. That's something I really look forward to. Mm-hmm. And when it comes to these native crayfish, they're super, super fascinating, and they are really important to the ecosystem. Often these crayfish are great indicators of environmental health. Oftentimes, if there's some kind of environmental catastrophe, crayfish are some of the first organisms to die. These burrowing crayfish are really awesome because they can aerate your soil, compacted soil, so it's good for plant growth. And a lot of animals, other insects, snakes, other amphibians or frogs, often use crayfish burrows during different periods of their life for protection, or when there's droughts, they actually will crawl into crayfish burrows and live there for a period of time.
How about that?
Yeah, very fascinating.
You mentioned some of those names. I was reading through some of the notes that you gave me too. Big black rock snail. Mm-hmm. And that was a recent project, a rediscovery project. So what is that? What's a rediscovery project? Well,
this project it involves a snail, right? I do a little bit more than just crayfish. This project really started in 2021 when I first got to the museum, and first got to Mississippi, we were doing a freshwater mollusk survey. Me, another colleague of mine, Robbie Ellwanger, the ichthyologist, and he's a malacologist, studies freshwater mussels. And so we were doing a survey of the Big Black River. We went from the headwaters all the way down to the mouth where it hits the Mississippi, floating in kayaks or canoes or using a boat predominantly, looking for freshwater mussels. And we had heard that there was this snail called the Big Black Rock Snail, but people had been looking for it for a long time. They only found it, a handful of times and never saw it again. And so we were aware of this. I didn't know anything about snails, or aquatic snails predominantly. And we got down to the lower portions, the last basically excursion of this survey. And it was like a 50, 60 mile stretch of this remote section of the Big Black River around Edwards. And we had to camp overnight on the river to just survey this whole thing, because we couldn't do the whole stretch if we didn't sleep on the river that night. Yeah. And so in the middle of that section, one of our technicians, he picked up a snail shell, and we didn't know what it was or anything, and it was dead. And we were like, it's just rolling around the river for all these years, who knows? And so we completed the survey. We kind of thought about it. And the following year, in 2022, there was a drought in Mississippi. I think 2022, 2023, we had some pretty low water level events. Mm-hmm. And we were like, hey, let's go back out there. We also had found a really cool mussel species called the rabbit's foot. Really, really cool at-risk species. Mussels also have really cool names. And so we went back, and lo and behold, the snail was there. And it was in the thousands. And so this species was declared extinct. And so our discovery was the first time seeing this species alive since the 1960s. And so it was a really, really cool thing to be a part of. Wow. So that's basically that's what a rediscovery kind of event is.
Yeah. So what, almost 60 years later?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Since anyone had seen it.
Yeah. And so it's like the Big Black River, if you've ever been on it, is really a lot of silt, a lot of mud on the river. But in the middle section of the Big Black River, there's a really tiny, tiny portion of gravel. And so this snails don't really love silt, and this particular snail doesn't really like silt. They don't like the fine sediments. It needs hard surfaces to graze algae. They're kind of the cows of the river, right? They clean up the river system by grazing on algae. And so we did a survey of the species and trying to find it at more locations. And we only found it at 5 locations in the Big Black River. It's found nowhere else in the world. It is one of the most narrow range restricted species in the planet. And it's only living on this really, really tiny, narrow section of gravel on the Big Black River. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of like finding a gold nugget.
Yeah, it was. We were jumping for joy. It was one of the most exciting days of my life. It was so much fun to be a part of.
And to find thousands of them.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder where they were hiding all this time.
Yeah, I know. And so that's the thing is, like, I don't know if it really was hiding. It was just that we just timed it really, really perfectly when we would find them. And I'm a crayfish biologist and aquatic biologist, and there's just not a lot of us. And so there's just hasn't been that much effort to try to find these things through time. So.
Yeah. So canoeing on the Big Black, you ever see an alligator?
Oh yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of, we it was always kind of fun. It was always really fun, especially in the morning. We get in the boat and, turning each river bend, and we'd see, a gator slide off. And oftentimes I had a couple of encounters of, like, we'd go down. So when we're looking for mussels, we just dive completely under the water. And sometimes we go up to like 10, 12 feet deep. Okay. Usually I like to stay more in the shallows than that, maybe around like 6 feet, something I could stand up in. And a couple times I would get up, and then there'd be a little squeaker of a gator kind of checking me out.
What about this one last year? Banded mudbug.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I say mudbug, we know what that means. It means crawfish. But what is a banded mudbug?
Yeah, so abandoned mudbug. I did a survey for these are 2 crayfish, the abandoned mudbug and the lonesome gravedigger. A mudbug is generally we use that terminology for a crayfish that is a burrowing crayfish that burrows down into the ground. Sometimes these crayfish can dig, 1 meter to 6 feet deep, so they can dig fairly deep and they can have complex tunnels. But this crayfish, like I said, crayfish they're not well studied in the state of Mississippi, and this crayfish wasn't even known to science. No one had known that this thing was a species until about 2020. And so we had very limited information on where this species actually occurs, what kind of threats are there that might face this particular species. And so we went down to southeastern Mississippi and tried looking for the thing. And really what that entails is, we're driving around in a truck. We're usually stopping in ditches or fields. That's kind of where this crayfish lives. And so
when you say a ditch, you don't mean with water in it necessarily.
It can it can have water in it.
It doesn't have to be, but can be?
It can be, yeah.
Okay.
So these crayfish, they dig down into the ground. Often these are roadside ditches, if I'm maybe clarifying it a little bit. And so the crayfish live in the water table under the surface. Okay. So the crayfish need water. They have gills like a fish. So that's kind of the habitat we're sampling in these ditches, and we'll take little garden shovels, and we're basically kind of cutting away at the soil, sticking our hand down into the earth, sometimes up to our sockets, and just trying to physically grab that crayfish out of there. There's also some funny looking slurp guns or shrimp guns you can use that you can create a suction and try to withdraw that crayfish out of the hole, and you can blast it out of there when the crayfish is very deep. So yeah, we surveyed I think we went to over 200 locations, and we found the thing at 11 locations that it wasn't previously documented at. And it seems to be doing all right. It's stable, but it's found in a very, very small portion of the state.
You ever get any funny looks from passersby? You're in the ditch next to the road, down to your shoulder in the ground.
Yeah, I get a lot of people giving me some strange looks. We also, a common technique we do is these crayfish can come out at night. They're more of a nocturnal animal. And so some of the best times to go looking for crayfish is at nighttime after like a heavy rain. Okay. And so I've been stopped a few times by the local police saying, "Hey, are you good? Are you like trying to hitchhike home? Is your truck okay?" I'm like, "No, I'm perfectly fine. I'm just looking for crayfish. So don't mind me." And I do get some strange looks, often just covered in mud.
Yeah, so. Sure. I guess that goes with the territory in this job.
Yeah.
And I see this year Jackson Prairie crayfish.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What's that one about?
That's another really exciting crayfish that I will be doing a project on here starting in about a couple weeks. Okay. So if you see me out there, I'll be in Scott County, Rankin, anywhere from east of the Pearl to the state line. So this crayfish only lives in the Jackson Prairie ecoregion of Mississippi, runs a little bit into Alabama. And so this crayfish is what we call predominantly lives in prairie habitats. It's a burrowing crayfish. It's really it's a difficult crayfish to actually observe and document because it digs really deep down into the ground, and it lives in really densely packed clay soils. So it's really a hard crayfish to actually dig up and get your hands on. So we get a little tricky with it, and we have some PVC pipes we've constructed with basically a one-way trap door that we're going to stick on the tops of the burrows. We're going to try going out at night and trying to find these things on the surface. It's a really cool looking crayfish. It's one of those crayfish that are electric blue, and they have a beard. So the beard is not located along the face. It's actually located along the claws of the crayfish. So it's got densely packed hairs that it'll actually dig, it'll get food, it'll eat plant material, whatever, and it'll just kind of use those hairs to kind of consume particulates that it's digging up. So
and it's blue.
Blue. Yeah, electric blue. So
Okay.
I've been able to see them on one occasion on the surface. And there's, like 5, 6 of them just walking around. This is usually when they're breeding, kind of defending territories, or these crayfish actually kind of sit at the entrances of their burrows, and different spiders, different insects will come along, and they basically are an ambush predator. Crayfish are kind of what we like to say in the crayfish world is crayfish eat everything and everything eats crayfish, right? So they'll just consume anything that kind of comes across their path.
Yeah. Well, and you said it. There's a lot of crayfish are consumed by people in our state.
Yes,
at a certain time of year. Rumor has it Chip likes a good crawfish boil.
I love it.
Really? Yeah. Oh, me too.
Okay, so my question is, what makes for a good crawfish season? Like, what is going on in the environment that affects how much they cost, how many have reproduced that year? Can you tell us about that?
Yeah. So crayfish, I mean, they can have multiple clutches a year, and then we're talking about the red swamp crayfish and the white river crayfish. The two biggest factors that really impact crayfish production in an aquaculture type setting is droughts, long periods of droughts. So if we have long periods of droughts in the summer and into the fall, that can be real hard on these crayfish, right? The red swamp crayfish and the white river crayfish are predominantly just stream or pond dwelling crayfish. They can dig, but they don't dig very well. They have slender claws. And so as that water level drops, at some point that pond's going to dry up. The crayfish can dig a little bit, but then they will pretty much suffocate because they can no longer breathe. And then cold temperatures and in the wintertime can have a real hard time on impacts on crayfish, and just lots of rain in the winter and fall months are really ideal and good for crayfish. So what I've been looking up is that it seems like it should be a good crayfish year in 2025. So you're in luck, Chip.
And you are too. You said you enjoy the crawfish boil also.
We get together with some friends and we do some fishing at his pond and eat a bunch of spicy crayfish, and it's a really good time.
Chip, do you consider yourself an expert peeler and eater of crawfish?
Yes.
Like,
in fact, so where my girlfriend's from, they don't consume crawfish because she's from Chile, and she was talking about how she's not good at peeling the crawfish, which is why she doesn't like crawfish boils as much as I do. And so, I've told her that if I'm eating crawfish with someone else, I usually tell them to get their own crawfish because they're not going to outpeel me ever. I will be done with probably 3 pounds of crawfish by the time they get done with one.
That's impressive. I saw a guy once. It was a bunch of football coaches having crawfish sort of at their intermission of a golf tournament, a benefit golf tournament. There was this big football coach in Mississippi, and he was I called him a double barrel crawfish eater. He had 3 plates in front of him, okay?
My gosh.
One under his right hand piled high with crawfish, one under his left hand, and in the middle, a plate to throw the shells. And he would bring one hand, peel it, and eat it one-handed. And as he was pulling it away, here came the other hand with one in this hand. He didn't need 2 hands to do it, Chip. One hand is all he needed, and it was like this, and throw away. It was
all right. Now that's impressive.
Is that you, Chip?
I can't do that.
That's gold. You got to get there.
I'll have to work on the one-handed thing this year.
I don't know how he did it, and it was fast, and all he needed. I mean, I've never seen anybody put it away faster and cleaner than he did. One at a time, one hand, peel, eat, throw away, like that's a juggling
impressive.
act almost.
That's really impressive. I'd watch that. I'd pay to watch something like that.
Yeah, I
was suck on the head too.
Yeah, well, every now and then, but that only slowed him down. That just slowed him down. I just wish I had it on video. We'd go viral, but we certainly love it. And you said it too. Like, it's not just us. Everything eats crawfish.
Yeah,
and not just fish. So, other than humans and fish, what is maybe like a primary predator of crawfish in Mississippi? Would you say?
Yeah, humans and fish. I mean, it's really across the board. Any vertebrate animal that, lives by an aquatic source probably eats crayfish.
Raccoons.
There's raccoons, there's specific snakes that will go into crayfish burrows and consume crayfish. I've heard from some coworkers and of hawks that will roost near locations that have dense populations of burrowing crayfish. And as those crayfish kind of come up, they're on the surface, those hawks will come by and just snag them.
Okay. So, all right. When you're driving down the highway and you see that big red-tailed hawk drop off the power line and go straight down, and you always assume, he's gotten a mouse or a rabbit or something. It could be a crawfish coming out of the ground.
Definitely could be a crawfish. Yeah, I've been to some areas where it's like a massacre of, there's crawfish limbs and heads everywhere. And I suspect that it's things like hawks or even maybe owls taking them out.
That's pretty fascinating. Well, so if you're listening, okay, and you see Calvin out on the side of the highway in 2025, he ask him if he needs a ride. He might, but he's probably doing, research. And what if you see some blue crawfish, call him, let him know,
Call me
right?
up. Yes, please. I'd love to know if you've got some crawfish on your property, and I'll come check them out and tell you what you got.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
Calvin, thanks for being on the show. Great to meet you.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yep. Thank you for listening to the Mississippi Outdoors Podcast, and we'll see you outdoors.